Okay, well, we're deep into the Easter season, and we spent the month of March talking about Lent unity style, which is really an opportunity for us to grow in spiritual depth and self-awareness. We were working with the four agreements as practical examples of how to learn how to fast and abstain from thoughts and actions that get in the way of our spiritual growth and evolution. Well, now as we're getting a little closer to Easter, we're going to be shifting our focus from the meaning of Lent to the so-called reason for the season. Even if you're not a Christian, Easter and Christmas unavoidably bring us face to face with the eternal question of what do these events mean today? Who was Jesus? And why should we care? The fact is that lots of people care. And I'm not just talking about the evangelical Christians out there. There are new books about Jesus being published every week, maybe even every day. And one that caught my attention recently is by a favorite author of mine that I've talked about before, Bart Ehrman, who is not an evangelical. He describes himself as an agnostic. And the new book is called How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. And this one is hot off the presses. And here's a quote. This is from an article that Dr. Ehrman wrote promoting the book. Here's what he said. How did Jesus become God? That's the question I address in my book, and I think it's an inordinately important one, not just for Christians who personally believe that Jesus really is God, but for all of us, whether believers or non-believers, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, agnostics, atheists, all of us who are interested, as well we ought to be, in the history of Western civilization. It is not hard to make the argument that if Jesus had never been declared God, our form of civilization would have been unalterably and indescribably different. Reflect on that sometime. We're going to talk more about Jesus and divinity and some of the ideas of this book at the end of the month, but the part of the quote I really want to zero in on here this morning is the part about how the history of Western civilization has been shaped by the story of the life of the man from Galilee. Even for the spiritual but not religious crowd, Jesus is the primary role model for Western spirituality. That's just the way it is. So that's one answer to the question of why should we care. Another reason we should care is that the essential teachings of Jesus continue to stand on their own merits today. The biggest challenge is separating the teachings of Jesus from the stuff that people made up about him later on. And as I mentioned earlier, the books are literally rolling off the presses about Jesus, and another very recent one that I've just been looking at has an interesting title. This book is called Jesus Gate. Jesus Gate. Yeah, everybody pins that word gate to everything, but he calls it a history of concealment unraveled. And this author is a Methodist minister who now teaches religious studies at a community college in Arizona. The reason he calls the book Jesus Gate is because, just like the Watergate scandal, there's been a cover-up. But this time, it's not about a burglary. The cover-up is about the life of Jesus. Most ministers these days who are graduated from a academically accredited non-evangelical seminary quickly learn that the very clear consensus among Bible scholars today is that stories of things like the virgin birth, miracles, the resurrection, the ascension, the second coming are mythological rather than historical. Unfortunately, many of these ministers hide this information. They hide it from their congregations, and they do it for a lot of different reasons. Some ministers are required to follow a creed or a statement of faith or something that doesn't allow them to disclose stuff that they learn at the university in front of their congregations. Others are simply afraid that their churches are too conservative. And if they dare to preach the truth, they'll lose membership in the church. Or they might even lose their jobs if enough people don't like what they're hearing. So, as a result today, so much of what passes for Christianity in the USA is still stuck in a pre-modern understanding of Jesus based on outdated and discredited methods of Bible study and interpretation. I can personally attest to this because over the years I have taught dozens of Bible classes here at Unity of Auburn. We focus on all of the fascinating discoveries of what we now know about Bible history. And most of the people in those classes, and especially the ones who are new to Unity, are excited to find a new way to read these stories. They come alive again. They become relevant when we demythologize them. And there are always a handful of students who tell me later on that it brought up some anger. It brought up some anger in them because the information wasn't made available at the non-Unity church that they used to attend. They never heard any of this stuff before. And I would say maybe that the anger is a little bit justified because there is a sense of betrayal. Someone they trusted to give them the truth actually misled them by omission. You know, it's like that scene in the movie, A Few Good Men. Remember that? Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. Tom Cruise is a military lawyer. He's cross-examining Jack Nicholson and he says, "I want the truth." And Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth." Well, we beg to differ. We beg to differ. Here we think that people can handle the truth. Not only can they handle it, but they're entitled to it so that they can sit down with it and decide what they want to do with it. Bishop John Shelby Spong once said, "If one's faith has to be protected from truth, it has already died." Bishop Spong was one of the first authors I ever read who wrote books for lay people explaining how the Bible is composed of this combination of myth and history. And if a person's faith is based on the idea that every single story in the Gospels must be a historical fact, then modern Bible scholarship is going to be perceived as a deadly threat. Blasphemy, they scream. Heresy. Don't you dare tell me anything that contradicts my beliefs. And I find it wonderfully ironic that when you read the Gospels, you see Jesus himself being called a heretic, a blasphemer. To the Jewish religious authorities of his day, he was the heretic in chief, challenging some of the most cherished beliefs of that ancient religion. Even though the Romans were the ones who executed him for being a public nuisance, the religious authorities have been looking for ways to get rid of him for years. They weren't sorry to see him go. And that's one of the faces of Jesus. The guy who was trying to break down religious boundaries. In his book, Jesus for the Non-Religious, John Spong recounts all of the ways that Jesus tried to break down these traditional barriers and boundaries. Religion during the time of Jesus had rules, lots of rules, that were absolute, especially the moral rules. Sometime when you're having trouble sleeping at night, read Leviticus, the book of Leviticus. More rules and regulations than you can shake a stick at. And each and every violation of the rules had to be punished in some way, because if not, the belief was that, hey, the wrath of God is going to come down on the whole community if we don't find a way to enforce these rules. So what kind of a neighborhood environment might be created by that sort of mentality? The term Orwellian comes to mind. Always being watched and judged by others like some ancient version of Big Brother is watching you, that kind of a thing. Some of the things that this kind of mentality never creates is compassion, understanding, and peace. This mentality doesn't expand life. So when Jesus was confronted by this mentality, he challenged it. I think a great example that you might recall is the story of the woman who was caught in adultery. Caught in the act, or as they say, in flagrante delicto, to be legalistic about it. So the scribes and the Pharisees, and these were the legal and religious authorities of the day, they bring her before Jesus. Now what are they up to here? They bring her before Jesus because they want to see him impose the death penalty. Death by stoning, as required by the law of Moses. They're going to get Jesus, the great healer, the great peacemaker, to condemn someone to death. What do you think that might do to his standing in the eyes of his followers? Maybe some of his followers might turn against him. And, you see, they can't lose here. If he refuses to impose the death penalty, if he refuses to enforce the law of Moses, then they might be able to bring some other charge against him, official blasphemy or heresy. So this is a no-win situation for Jesus, or so it sounds. They bring the woman before him, and they tell him that the law of Moses commands us to stone her. What do you say, smart guy? That's the tone they bring. What do you say? What do you say, teacher? And you can almost imagine the tone of voice they're saying this in because they're setting him up. And here Jesus does something that is still such an excellent idea today. He keeps his mouth shut. He lets him sit in silence. He lets him stew while he takes a few moments to think about his answer. Engage the brain before opening the mouth. Wouldn't it be great if more people did that today? This is relevant. This is relevant stuff today. And so Jesus, he pauses, he's silent, he makes some doodles in the dirt, and then he says those famous words that everyone remembers. He says, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he goes back to doodling. And slowly, everyone walks away. Do you see how brilliant that was?
Yeah.
Do you see how brilliant that was? He didn't go into a lecture on ethics and the law of Moses. He didn't get into an argument with them about whether stoning is cruel and unusual punishment and whether there's maybe a more humane way to put sin. None of this kind of stuff. He doesn't start arguing with them. He appeals directly to their humanity. He immediately invokes the human condition. We're all in this together, is what he's saying. And they're the ones who finally decide that the law wasn't so important at this new level of self-awareness that he brought about, this shift in consciousness, as we like to call it. They realized that if they carried out the law of Moses, it wouldn't make them better human beings. It really wouldn't make them better at anything. They needed to work on their own shortcomings first. That's a big aha. And so, after everyone leaves, there's Jesus and the woman, and he says to her, "Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one." And Jesus says, "Neither do I. Go on your way." That's it. Of course, the story leaves me with a really big question. Where was the guy? Yes, think about it. She was caught in the act, so the story says. So what? The guy gets a pass and the woman gets stoned? It's another face of Jesus that we see in the same story. The breaker of prejudices and stereotypes. He treats everyone fairly, even those who happen to be of the wrong gender in those days, or those who were unclean, or maybe who were from the wrong ethnic group. There's another story, this time involving another woman, his encounter with a Samaritan woman who's drawing water from a well. Don't have to go into detail in that today, but he has a long, a deep, and very significant conversation with this foreign woman, a Samaritan. You hear that word a lot in the Gospels. Samaritans were this despised ethnic group. People would try to go out of their way, literally go on the other side of the street to avoid passing by someone who they knew to be a Samaritan. And she's a woman. 2 strikes against her back in those days. But Jesus breaks down both barriers all in one conversation. Okay, so speaking for me personally, I find these kinds of stories to be far more impressive and memorable and inspiring than any of the flashy miracle stories. More powerful than a virgin birth, walking on water, or even rising from the dead. Seen anyone walking on water lately? No one? It's not a skill that we see being practiced. I didn't think we'd find anybody walking on water. However, seen anyone breaking down some barriers lately in our lifetime? Oh yeah, lots of that still going on. We don't need people to walk on water or fly off into the cloud. We need people who can show us how to be complete and whole human beings, who can show us what it means to live a life that's infused with divine ideas like compassion, equality, justice, and just plain, basic kindness. Maybe there was a time when people thought that that wasn't enough to make us remember these stories, so they added the bling. They added the flashy miracle stories and such. Or maybe they got caught up in that all too human practice of embellishing the story of someone that they loved and admired greatly. Whatever the reason, separating the myth from the message takes nothing away. In fact, I think it adds another dimension of relevance and another dimension of power to these stories when we do that. We'll talk a little more about that next week. Thank you.